Greetings, Ride Forever. You gave me a comment on my latest YouTube video and were asking questions about the Civil War and Reconstruction, specifically concerning emancipation. I started writing you a response, but I figured it would be better just to make a response video and talk about it rather than write it out. So, I'll read your question and then I'll begin responding to you. Ride Forever says, "Hello, I wanted to ask you some historical things. I was thinking that after the American emancipation, it must have been a big shock for Europeans to suddenly live in a society that did not look like Europe, and that they must have reacted strongly to it. That is the first thing. The second is, I don't know much about history, but what was the actual reason for that emancipation? It seems quite a strange thing to do. Was it done by utopians, by Protestants, people wishing to prove a point? Was it done in order to destroy somebody, or for commerce reasons? Was there a discussion of giving the former slaves their own land? If you have any recommended sources, I would be grateful." Well, I appreciate such a profound series of questions. This really is a very interesting matter, and these questions should reveal some important points. Um, the let's begin with the first question. I was thinking that after the American emancipation, it must have been a big shock for Europeans to suddenly live in a society that did not look like Europe. Well, in the South, when emancipation struck, it obviously meant a very profound social change. The emancipation of the slaves immediately leads to serious questions about their participation in the political process in the American Republic. So, no longer are they in a paternalist structure where their owners are taking responsibility for every aspect of their lives from cradle to grave. No longer is another person responsible for the providence of the slave as the slave lives, or responsible for the administration of justice over the slave. Obviously, these are all huge points. Now the slaves must fend for themselves as free men and women. This is a massive transfer of responsibility. But the point that I wanted to make here is that in the slave-holding states, this was a society from colonial days that was very different than Europe in that it had this large element of Africans as part of the society. You may have found European feudal societies with a large element of slaves in them. I'm trying to think of any European example to this. The largest difference in Europe, whether we're talking about the latifundia of late Republican Rome, where you have areas of the Roman countryside that are mostly populated with slaves, and there are a few large landholders there. This was a destabilizing thing in the Roman Republic. The major difference, say, in that society where there are large numbers of slaves in the Roman Republic would be that the slaves are Mediterraneans. They are war captives. They would be Carthaginians, things like that in that example. But they aren't far removed culturally. That's a very important distinction. The Roman slave, emancipated, did not have as many barriers for participation in Roman society as did an African slave emancipated in an American context. This is because there is not such a gulf in cultural attainment. or cultural inheritance. One very important aspect is that Romans would freely mix with Carthaginians. They could marry them, especially after the religious difference is destroyed by the destruction of the Carthaginian religion in the Punic Wars. The Carthaginians adopt Roman religion, and there are fewer differences between the groups. They are willing to mix. They are willing to amalgamate, and this element, the emancipated Roman slave, can, if he can get property, he can be recognized as a Roman citizen in the old style, in the Roman Republican style. There are many more barriers in the American context. So my major point here is that in the American context, European Americans had become accustomed to a large minority of African slaves in their presence. That itself wasn't new. What was new was the status of the African American. Along those lines, it's important to note that in several southern states, I believe it's South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, the black population is the majority of the population in 1865. So this means that not only are the ex-Confederates in 65, not only are they barred from holding office and mostly barred from participating in the political process, the newly emancipated slaves have also been enfranchised, which makes these basically African American republics. They are the majority of the population. They are the majority of the participants in the political process. So this is a very dramatic change. And that would be the element that would be so new. Not for European Americans to live alongside Africans. They had been doing that since colonial days. Okay, so they must have reacted strongly to it. Well, yes. They considered this a really incredible revolutionary change. There was a lot of anticipation of violence. It was quite extraordinary that there was so little violence. That's something that I find very impressive. That it took some years for there to be an outpouring of vigilante violence. This is something that a lot of people associate with Reconstruction, the actions of vigilante groups. Primarily, people think of the Ku Klux Klan, and that is true. They were a vigilante group. They did execute people outside of the judicial process. But there were other vigilante groups as well, not all of whom were associated primarily with white Southern Democrats or ex-Confederates. There were the Union Leagues, for instance, who also committed vigilante action, armed their members, paraded them, had secret rights like the Klan. These are all interesting things, perhaps, but it was not something exclusive to white Southern Democrats. What is most impressive to me is that this extrajudicial violence did take some years to really develop and go mainstream. The first outbreaks of violence in the period after the war were riots in Memphis, which took place between African American Union conscripts that were members of the Union Army that were occupying the city there in the years after the war. In the wisdom of the federal government, they decided to garrison southern cities with conscript black troops. I think that there was something very subversive in that decision. In Memphis, there was some dispute. I think it involved women between black conscripts and the majority Irish police department of Memphis, who themselves were immigrants. So these are recent arrivals born in Ireland who had populated the Memphis Police Department, and there was an outbreak of violence between them and the black conscripts. So this was characterized as a race riot, and in some levels it certainly was racial conflict. It just wasn't racial conflict between native-born Southern whites and the black conscripts. So that's an interesting tale. The other major riot took place in New Orleans, and it was it concerned a controversial call for a constitutional convention. So radical Republicans who had monopoly on the political power at that time were talking about preserving a early rewrite of the Louisiana Constitution that had been promulgated during the occupation of New Orleans by General Nathaniel Banks early in the war. So in late 1862, early 1863, there was a Unionist Republican written constitution for Louisiana that promised, among other things, suffrage for the freemen of Louisiana. This was done without the say for the majority of the state. So because most of Louisiana was still being run by the Confederate government of Louisiana and had not been conquered by the Union government yet. So there were, in effect, two governments of Louisiana that existed simultaneously. One was more or less exclusive to the city of New Orleans. So it was that constitution that was written by the Republican military occupation during the war that was in dispute. And there was a call for a new constitutional convention. There was a riot that broke out about that call to preserve the Constitution. It brought lots of concerned Louisiana black freemen to the streets. Probably a lot of people who were free before the Civil War, but certainly attract lots of the freedmen who had been freed by the 13th Amendment, which had just recently been promulgated. So they were all then free from slavery, and quite a few of them came down to New Orleans in that year following the war, looking for work. Not surprisingly, they needed employment to survive, and there was very little of that to be had in the countryside. So the city is swelling with black freedmen refugees, and the word spreads that the Democrats are trying to organize to have a constitutional convention that could deprive the freedmen of their newfound political rights. This is all under discussion, but it hasn't actually happened yet. And there's a riot that forms at Mechanics Hall, or the Mechanics Institute on Canal Street, which is serving as the temporary capital of the state. And there are quite a few people killed, most of them freemen and freedmen, by white rioters who are protesting the Republican Constitution that is in controversy. So I know that this is all very convoluted. I'm doing this without notes, just from memory. So if I get something wrong there, please forgive me. But that's more or less what's going on in New Orleans, and that's in 1866, 1867. That takes place. It takes place the same summer as the riots in Memphis. But then it's some time later that you see the vigilante action. Okay, so you say that is the first thing. The second is, I don't know much about the history, but what was the actual reason for emancipation? Okay, this is a very interesting question. I recommend a couple of resources for this, go find Avery Craven's Coming of the Civil War, and I like to recommend this book, but it's increasingly difficult to acquire. Ludwell Johnson's North Against South is a very good little book that does address this issue. Lincoln chose to inaugurate civil war, in the words of Virginia's Governor Letcher, to preserve the Union. This is what he told the editor Horace Greeley in the New York Tribune. He published an open letter in the New York Tribune in '62 saying that his primary goal in the conflict is to save the Union and not to save or destroy slavery. That's what Lincoln says. Lincoln says to Horace Greeley in this open letter in the New York Tribune that if he could save the Union by destroying slavery, he would do that. If he could save the Union by freeing some slaves and leaving others as they are, he would do that. If he could save the Union by preserving slavery, he would also do that. He says, everything that I do in this struggle concerns the Union and not slavery. So at the end of '62, Lincoln publishes a preliminary to the Emancipation Proclamation. He says, he warns his Confederate opponents, you must lay down your arms and submit to the federal authorities by the end of the year, or I will resort to an emancipation measure. If you want to avoid the consequences of the emancipation measure, you need to submit to the federal authorities now. You need to rescind your secession ordinances. You need to disband your armies and lay down your arms. You need to return to the Union government, presumably sending representatives back to Washington. This preliminary is ignored by the Confederate authorities. Their armies remain in the field. Many campaigns are in progress and battles are fought. At the end of the year, Lincoln publishes his Emancipation Proclamation. This is an executive order. It does not go through Congress. The Emancipation Proclamation is a very interesting document. It says that slaves in Confederate-controlled territories, or most Confederate-controlled territories, are declared free, and the legal recognition of slavery is dissolved in those areas, but in areas controlled by the federal government, including the southern parishes of Louisiana, the areas of Virginia, the counties of Virginia that are then under occupation, those areas, the Emancipation Proclamation does not apply. It does not apply in Union states like Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. There are slaves in those states. And the Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to them. So a good portion of the document, a good fifth of the document, say, is a list of places where the Emancipation Proclamation does not apply. Now, Lincoln does not explain why he is doing this, but I think that we can see from his thoughts on the matter, his rationale. He wants to do something to affect the course of the war and also to affect his support in the North. Through the Emancipation Proclamation, though it's not an ideological document, obviously, he does shore up a lot of support among radical humanitarians and abolitionists in the North. Now, you mention radical Protestants, utopians trying to make a point. Undoubtedly, there are a very vocal and literary set in places like New England and Ohio, coalescing around cities like Boston, colleges like Oberlin College, and Hillsdale College in Michigan, actually, who are very vocal in their abolitionist sympathies. they want a radical policy of the abolition of slavery. Up until that time, there was no political party, there was no statesman that was vocally supporting the radical abolition of slavery, the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of the slaves, for the very simple reason that that isn't a political position. Now, this becomes confusing to us because we live in an age that is increasingly devoid of politics, though we're constantly thinking about political issues. So many of these conflicts are actually zero-sum conflicts. There is no means by which to compromise. Will we have open borders, or will we enforce the existing law concerning immigration and naturalization? No one is talking about making deals to agree between those two positions. That's an existential sort of conflict. And we see the establishment is obviously entirely in one camp there. And that's not a political issue so much as it is an existential issue. So the abolitionist position is so radical, it's an existential issue. And that is why the politicians of the day don't touch it. They're politicians. Whatever else you might say about them, they believe, because they are politicians, that you have to make an effort to deal with your political foes. Well, in the case of war, you are going to use violence to deal with your political foes. Therefore, existential questions can be entertained as policy. So Lincoln is adopting some abolitionist policies then. It's obviously not a doctrinaire thing. He's not talking about ending slavery as an institution in America. That is accomplished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution after Lincoln dies, after he is assassinated. So, emancipation, why emancipation? It only makes sense as a war measure, and to shore up some support among idealists in the North, who are a small set, who are already more or less in favor of the war. So he does shore up a little bit of support, but it's thought at the time it's mostly to shore up humanitarian opinion abroad. Lincoln has not won very many victories by the end of '62. He has faced many embarrassments, and he is shoring up opinion among European powers who have already ended legal slavery in their domestic spheres and in their empires. In that, I think he is successful. That's seems to be why he's doing it, not out of conviction that that's what justifies the war. I think it's very clear in all of our evidence that's not how Lincoln justified the war. He said the war was to preserve the Union. But midway through the war, he adds the abolition of slavery as another aspect of the war and a secondary policy. You say emancipation, was it done by utopians and Protestants, people wishing to prove a point? This is certainly part of the reasoning of abolitionists in the North. I'm doing a lot of work right now on Charles Francis Adams Jr., the grandson of President John Quincy Adams, the great-grandson of President John Adams, a brother to the historian Henry Adams. Charles Francis Adams Jr. wrote about this. He wrote about the idealistic, optimistic progressives of Massachusetts. He said that they believed that the black man had never been given a fair chance, and if given political and legal emancipation to handle his own affairs, he would prove to be culturally just as capable as any white man. And the line he uses to describe the position is that the humanitarians and abolitionists, they believed that the black man had never been given a fair chance in society. And this drove some of their idealistic policies, especially during Reconstruction. So the war does not accomplish the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment does after the war has concluded. And that is ratified by Congress, and it is voted on by southern states. And most southern states ratify the 13th Amendment. Now, we could say, well, those are unionist governments. The ex-Confederates and Democrats are excluded from many of those governments. That is true. I'm not here to quibble about that. I'm just saying that Southerners did participate in the ratification of the 13th Amendment on some level. But it was also just months after the end of the war, so it's not going to be a fair process at that point. The southern country is under military occupation at that time. Great deal of their citizens are displaced away from home. The soldiers are making their way home. It takes months for these soldiers to get home. In many instances, it's a very disrupted position. But that's a quibble. I'm not trying to get into that. So the idea of emancipation and the idea of the political integration of the African into American society is spearheaded by optimistic progressives, whose ideas should be extremely familiar to us because that has more or less been the establishment opinion ever since. Charles Francis Adams notwithstanding. He is an exception and is talking about these things in a remarkable way, but he is certainly not the mainstream. He is increasingly an eccentric in his time. Another exception would be the Jim Crow Southern political elites, who are not believers in the progressive cant on the subject, obviously. Okay, was emancipation done to destroy, you ask? Yes, I think that was certainly part of the foresight there. No one could talk about the legal establishment of political equality between slaves and the free white population without thinking of the massacres of Santo Domingo. This is early Republican Haiti. So the white population and the mixed population were ruthlessly massacred by slave rebels in the French colony, and those that could fled, many of whom came to Louisiana. The press in London reacted in a very interesting way to the news of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is itself a very interesting point because, as I said, Lincoln was wanting to shore up foreign opinion in favor of the Union effort, and he had to make a lot of effort on that front. The Confederates had made very early diplomatic inroads in France and in Britain, trying to get recognition for the Confederate States. And I think it's not that I think, the consensus is that Lincoln's greatest diplomatic victory was probably the Emancipation Proclamation. However, news of the Emancipation Proclamation was initially met with horror in the London press, who anticipated a racial war of extermination in the South. they anticipated that would result. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation itself contains evidence anticipating such a result, which is quite chilling, or should be. The Emancipation Proclamation says that the federal government will attempt to support the emancipated slaves in their attempts to defend themselves. Now, that is anticipating rebel slave armies in Confederate territory, presumably. That the slaves will have news of the Emancipation Proclamation, then will rise up, arm themselves, and contend with the civilian population deep inside of Confederate territory. Whether to dominate them or to break out and join with the Federals somewhere. The Emancipation Proclamation itself seems to anticipate that kind of action. That in itself is one of the most chilling things I think that has ever been produced by the federal government, because everyone involved in that production, in that plan, knew the story of Santo Domingo. This was very common knowledge at the time. So all of Lincoln's nice words about Southerners, besides, I think that that's a serious charge to make against the man's character, honestly. All right, so was it done to destroy something? It was probably done anticipating that the South would fall into a race war. It is very remarkable that they did not. And I think that this is a story that ought to be told, ought to be revived. It used to be a story that was celebrated on some level. Booker T. Washington very famously celebrated the fact that Southerners left their women and children at home with their slaves with a serious confidence. I wonder if it was ever a complete confidence, but it certainly was a serious confidence that their family members, their best beloved, were safe in the presence of their slaves in war conditions. And it's true, there were never any uprisings under those circumstances. The slaves would frequently escape into Union lines, but that's not at all the same thing. All right, so you say, was it for commerce reasons? Well, that was part of the program of the Republican Party. They wanted a free labor system across the United States. No slavery, everything would be according to free labor. Everyone would work for wages, and this was part of their vision of a business economy, a consumer economy. One example of this that I've been reflecting on a lot recently, when the Union Army first landed in Port Royal in South Carolina. They made an incursion. They took a couple of the sea islands south of Charleston. They lodged themselves in there, and it was a very difficult environment. They weren't able to penetrate the geography there and make inroads into the interior of the state, but they did capture a very wealthy area, a couple of port towns, and lots of slaves. The Union Army then invited a lot of Massachusetts philanthropists to come down to Port Royal and organize schoolhouses, organize a free labor system. They were declaring these slaves emancipated. This was before the Emancipation Proclamation, by the way. And they were dreaming of a future South that would have a free labor economy. So the Port Royal experiment is a fascinating thing. There is a book on the subject that I don't have with me. but I believe it's called the Port Royal Experiment. It's by a lady. I forget her name. But that's good reading. Um, One of the very amusing aspects is all these Massachusetts schoolmarms and philanthropists. They come down and they try to teach the slaves to do all sorts of Yankee folk ways, which is very amusing. They think that's the right way to live, and it doesn't take. They build schoolhouses and staff them with charitable donations, and one of the things that they remark about, and you find many of them remarking about it, is that these rustic Southerners don't have any stores. People aren't buying and selling things. There aren't peddlers that are pitching manufactured goods door to door. And they dream of the South they will build, which will have stores everywhere, and everyone will be buying and selling and consuming in manufactured goods of all sorts. And they don't know what the agricultural life is for the vast majority of Southerners, who are far less reliant on a consumer economy than they are. They reveal this about themselves, that they're all very reliant on a consumer economy. They imagine that that's the way everyone lives. They're really surprised to find people who don't live that way, and they immediately scheme for a plan to make over the economy there so that is the way that they live. And of course, this is prophetic of the future commerce of the United States, where virtually everyone is a consumer. That is one aspect of the Civil War that comes out in that circumstance. That is prophetic of how things change with the Civil War and what the future commercial and economic norms will be. That we all need money in our pockets more or less constantly. We need to spend this money to get everything we need to live. And our lifestyle is a constant cycle of buying, selling, and earning. And that was not the case in the rural antebellum South. And that was the way that the vast majority of Southerners lived. There were very few cities in the South. And they did not have money in their pockets. Farmers only get paid once a year. And that's a very different kind of economy. They still needed financial services and such. Farmers are notoriously indebted, and so were antebellum Southern farmers. But they were not a consumer economy. And this led people like Richard Weaver to say that the South was the last place in the world, the last non-materialist community in the Western world. And that has really interesting implications. It's a really incredible claim from Weaver. I think it's true, but it certainly deserves further investigation and contemplation there. All right, you finally ask, was there a discussion about giving the slaves their own land? Yes, this was a radical talking point during Reconstruction, and it would have involved massive ethnic cleansing to accomplish. Basically, the scheme was, let's confiscate land owned by Confederate veterans and redistribute it to the loyal slaves, notwithstanding that most slaves took no part in the war, and we can assume things about their political opinions. Naturally, they're going to want things that are in their own interests. Whatever we might get out of that, I'm not here to say. But that was the way that the freedmen were spoken of commonly immediately following the war, that they are the loyal freedmen. Let's reward those loyal to the Union. Now, to accomplish that, you would be evicting potentially millions of people from their homes. You would be confiscating their land. And you would be doing this on the ground that they were traitors to the state, therefore allowing them to live as a mercy. Now, this was literally done to a limited scale on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia. Now, what made that uh, a less dangerous policy there, let's say, less deadly to the population, was that the Sea Islands were already large plantations, the majority of whom's inhabitants were African American slaves. So the white population had already left as the Union Army approached, leaving their property, and this was considered contraband and spoils of war under martial law. So there was not a massive redistribution necessary to designate that area a black reservation, if you will. And that was the effect of an order of General Sherman, who came down to the Georgia coast at the end of 1864. He captures Savannah at the end of his famous march through Georgia. He then turns and goes into Carolina, captures and burns Columbia, South Carolina, and takes every Southern woman to the washtub, as he says, inflicting hell on the civilian population as if he is God on Judgment Day. And he makes military orders. I forget the name of his famous military order there, but he says, yes, the Sea Islands belong to the black people now, and white people aren't allowed to go there. He also sets up deliveries of relief supplies from the Freedmen's Bureau to the islands. This lasts for some years until there are successful legal disputes of the owners who had left their property there and could prove something about themselves. They were able to return. And this was considered betrayal by at least some of the inhabitants of some of the black inhabitants, the freedmen who had settled on these islands and started receiving supplies from the federal government to sustain themselves. They felt as if they had been betrayed by the reneging on that particular order. That was the only place it was seriously tried. But radicals in Congress talked about expelling the white population of the South, forcing them to immigrate abroad, confiscating their land, and also redistributing the population in very radical ways. So during the Grant administration, there were a couple of schemes that were floated, one of which came very close to fruition. Grant attempted to purchase the island of Hispaniola, which contains the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He wanted to turn this into a colony for the freedmen. So this would have meant a massive movement. However, if you look at the map, you see the island is relatively small compared to the territory of the United States. So would that have really been a colony large enough to contain the whole population of African American freedmen? I don't know. Seems very unlikely, and it would have meant an incredible amount of suffering, an incredible amount of deprivation. There wouldn't be housing there, even if you sent the whole United States Army to start building it all. It would have been a very traumatic transition, and it involves massive ethnic cleansing. Of course, you would have had the same thing you have with the establishment of Indian reservations out west, or say the Trail of Tears. This is one of the reasons why these things are condemned as a matter of course these days, because it results in massive human suffering. Joseph Stalin attempted to do this by creating autonomous oblasts for ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union, and on occasion forcibly removing populations, moving them across Siberia and such. We know how this results in mass death and suffering. So thankfully that didn't come about. the proposal to buy Santo Domingo, um, already negotiated by the president, was rejected by the Senate by a single vote. And this was U.S. Grant's Republican-dominated United States Senate. So he had Republicans that were opting out of that program, rejecting it. Another program that never resulted in any legislation or serious plans on paper was a proposal, and I want to say it was Hamilton Fish in the Treasury Department who had this proposal. I can't verify that. I would like details on that, but I don't have my library with me. So I believe it came out of the Treasury Department in the Grant administration to Africanize several southern states, which would mean expelling the white population and redistributing the property to the black population, and also bringing in the black population from the other American states, making them exclusively black, and presumably giving them, Republican or a representation in the republic. They would have their senators, their House members. They would have their own institutions on the state level, but there would be no white people there. That's another very radical proposal. Nothing ever came of it. It was never written up by a congressman, to my knowledge. It was something talked about in the executive department. But there we go. As far as books to read, I've named a few. If I think of more, I'll let you know. And thank you for your intelligent question.